Hi, everyone, near and far, all around the world, morning, afternoon, and evening. I'm Garrett Nelson, the curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library, and this is the third installment of our Angles on Bending Lines series, a live set of conversations about our new exhibition, Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. If you're just tuning in, it's only 5 minutes to the hour, and we always do a little behind-the-scenes tour while we wait for people to filter into the live stream. We'll bring in our guest, Judith Tyner, a little after 1. But until then, I'm going to show a couple of objects that didn't make their way into the exhibition. So today, it's actually an object that did make its way in, and a couple of its companion objects that take us deeper. So this object is in our exhibition in Bending Lines. It was published by the pioneering African-American social scientist, activist, historian, writer, W.E.B. Du Bois, himself a longtime resident of Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And this is a striking map which Du Bois created that shows the Black diaspora from Africa into the parts of the Americas where people had been forcibly brought through the institution of slavery. And this map appears at the beginning of a study that Du Bois produced with his students at Atlanta University in order to be part of the United States exhibition at the 1900 Universal Exposition in Paris. And it's a striking object because it's a concise and clear geographic argument for Du Bois's Pan-Africanism. Du Bois is famously remembered for the quote, "the problem of the color line." And Du Bois wanted to situate the problem of Black Americans into a larger context of the history of slavery, the history of African diaspora being brought to the Americas. And this map, which is titled Distribution of the Negro Race, puts that argument in a really striking way. We also pair this map in the exhibition with another piece that shows a dramatically different view of Africa, a British colonialist's map that describes, that shows the colonizability of Africa. So in contrast to that map, which sees Africa merely as a site of exploitation, this map, produced almost at exactly the same time, tells a much different tale about Black civil rights, Black Pan-Africanism, and the sorts of sociological work that Du Bois and others would do to carry that argument. So we have this map in the exhibition, but it was part of a larger series that Du Bois and his students produced. That's interesting not only for its cartographic significance, but because of the experiments which Du Bois carried out in looking at race and sociology, and in visualizing that data. Again, this was produced for a very public audience, a exhibition. So the American exhibition, produced in part by the Assistant Librarian of Congress, who was an African American, included a corner which was a Negro exhibition, which Du Bois was involved with. And there was a whole series of sociological studies and visualizations which Du Bois and his colleagues produced for it. Here's a dot map of McIntosh County, Georgia from the same study. Du Bois was really interested in the way that the United States had failed to keep the promise of emancipation by through the inequalities of the Jim Crow system. So Du Bois was really interested in how some freed slaves had made their way into middle-class society, but how many others had been trapped at the bottom of the United States class and racial hierarchy. So these colored dots show the different classes of Black inhabitants of McIntosh County, together with yellow dots showing white inhabitants. And these maps were coupled with diagrams like this one, a line graph showing the total valuation of Black-owned property in Georgia, starting at emancipation in 1870, taking off dramatically during the Reconstruction period, then slowing during the first era of post-Reconstruction, when Black rights were dramatically curtailed in the South as Southern whites coming out of Reconstruction reinstated their racial regime. the value of Black property exploding during the late 19th century as the South industrialized and Black middle classes in places like Atlanta started establishing institutions and universities like Atlanta University, to which Du Bois was associated with. And then finally tailing off towards the beginning of the 20th century as these racial regimes of expropriation continued to pull the Black middle classes back. And this is a fascinating object because it's not only a line graph that was produced through extensive social and economic survey, but Du Bois has included these labels on it, things like political unrest, disenfranchisement and prescriptive laws, lynching, financial panic, Ku Kluxism. Du Bois was a pioneer, again, not only in his arguments about race relations in the United States and about racial justice, but he was a sociologist who worked with these sorts of visual diagrams to make arguments using statistical evidence that coupled with his moral and ethical and political arguments. And so put together, these form a really interesting series. You can actually find the whole set at the Library of Congress, and they've recently been republished by the Princeton Architectural Press in a series on Du Bois's data visualizations. So take a look at the object that's in the exhibition and then learn more about Du Bois's work as a data designer, visualizer, and of course, as a activist. So it's now 1 o'clock. All of you have joined us. I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm the curator of maps at the Leventhal Map and Education Center. And this is our third installation of our Angles on Bending Lines conversation series, a companion set of live interviews with cartographers, scholars, map makers, designers, collectors. That's part of our new exhibition at the Map Center, Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. Many of you have probably had the chance to visit our online exhibition already. As you probably know, the Boston Public Library is still closed, though we hope to show the physical exhibition when we know more about our opening plans. In the meantime, you can visit our digital exhibition at leventhalmap.org. It's much more than just a collection of maps and captions online. It features interactive material. It allows you to zoom in and explore the maps in much greater depth, and to work with the objects and find new resources in really rich ways. So you can get to that from our website at leventhalmap.org or from our social media profiles. Before I start, just want to say a little bit about this series. As I said, this is the third in the series. The talks are Wednesdays at 1 p.m. You can always watch them after the fact on YouTube or Facebook. And our next installation will be next Wednesday on June 17th, the collector and historian P.J. Mode talking about different degrees of deception in maps. There are a couple of other live activities that I want to draw your attention to as well. This Friday, 2 days from now, 1 p.m., our excellent education team is going to lead an exhibition tour for educators or parents who are working with kids at home, showing how you can use the education components of the digital exhibition in learning exercises ranging from social studies to history, history of design, and cartography. I also, for those of you who crave ever more online content on the history of cartography, we are the co-sponsors of an informal series called Map Time with our friends at the Harvard Map Collection. My colleague Dave Weimer over at Harvard has been doing a lot of this while we've been running the Bending Line series. But if you're on Instagram Live, stop by Thursdays at noon for interviews with map collectors, librarians, cartographers, and others. So today on our third installation of Angles on Bending Lines, we have a really special guest. We have the person who created the term persuasive cartography, and that is Professor Judith Tyner. She's Professor Emerita at the California State University, Long Beach. Judith taught in the geography department there for over 35 years and was department chair for 6. And she was the director of the Cartography GIS certificate program from its inception until her retirement. While at CSU Long Beach, Dr. Tyner taught beginning and advanced cartography, map reading and interpretation, remote sensing, and the history of cartography. She's a member of the Association of American Geographers, the North American Cartographic Information Society, California Map Society, and the Society of Women Geographers. She's the author of 4 textbooks on map design and map reading, including Principles of Map Design and the World of Maps. She's the author of 2 scholarly books, Stitching the World and Women in American Cartography, the latter of which was highly influential in our own 2015-2016 exhibition, Women in Cartography. And finally, Dr. Tyner is the author of the 1974 PhD dissertation, Persuasive Cartography, an examination of the map as a subjective tool of communication. That was the dissertation in which the term persuasive cartography, which forms a kind of major conceptual category in our own exhibition, that's where it was coined. So let's welcome Judith to our live stream. Hi, Judith.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, it's so great to be here.
Good to be here.
It wouldn't be a series on persuasive cartography without getting to talk to you, so I'm so glad we were able to make it happen.
So am I.
So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself. You have a long career in teaching cartography, making maps, interpreting maps. Maybe you could say a little bit about how you came to the field, how you get interested in maps, and tell us a little bit about how your thinking led up to your 1974 dissertation in which you coined this term.
Okay, well, I think like most people who go into geography and cartography, it wasn't a nice direct path. I started at UCLA as a freshman, thinking that I was going to, well, and actually was majoring in math. But in those days, that wasn't the best choice for a girl in that very often I was the only female in the class, and sometimes it was a little awkward. And so after deciding that I really didn't like calculus, I took a semester off to rethink things, took a class at a community college, happened actually to be a geology class, but it was taught by a geographer. And so when I finished that semester, I went back to UCLA as a geography major. And I had no idea what I was going to do with it. I didn't know what cartographers were. I knew I liked maps, but beyond that. But I took my first map reading class and loved it. Took my first cartography class and I was hooked. And from then I went on and after I got my bachelor's, of course, did my master's with a cartographic topic, maps of the moon. And this was before they walked on the moon. And then my dissertation on persuasive cartography. And I haven't regretted it for a minute.
Great. And you mentioned the way that cartography was a discipline dominated certainly at the academic and professional level by men at that time. And we're really indebted to the work of you and others in showing the importance of women to the history of cartography. Of course, in your book, and if you want to see more maps that show the history of women in cartography, our 2015-16 exhibition, Women in Cartography, is available online from our exhibitions page, where you can look at more of that. So we're really lucky to have figures like you who've opened up the world of cartography, though I think we all know we still have quite a bit of work left to do.
And Alice Hudson, who was the instigator of that exhibit, she was the real pioneer on finding women who had worked in cartography. It's just some remarkable work that she did.
Yeah, it's an excellent exhibition. It was before my time at the Map Center, though I saw it as a patron. So I admired it from that side back in 2015. So we're going to talk a little bit about this term persuasive cartography, which has migrated from a term you coined for your dissertation into now a very mainstream and widely used category in the history of cartography. There are dealers who have whole persuasive cartography sections of their catalogs. There are libraries that include persuasive cartography as one of the categories of exploring their holdings. why don't we take a look at some of the maps that we've picked out, and then you can maybe tell us some of the ways that you think about what this term persuasive means when it's applied to cartography. So let's start with the first one we have here. Tell us a little bit about this map.
Okay, but this one isn't exactly a typical persuasive map, but it is persuasive. It's a typical pictorial map from a period that was considered the golden age of pictorial maps. And it is a map that is totally fictitious. It shows the Southwest, but it's not the real Southwest. There are no real places on it. And it's got a lot of humorous elements. This was, again, typical of the pictorial maps in this era. And it shows things like cars needing towing, cars overheating, and it features a Shell service station and a Shell billboard. The billboard's there. It is an advertising map, pure and simple. And the information on the reverse tells the user of all the services that Shell offers when you're off on that road trip and your car overheats and you need gas, whatever. And because of its humor and the style, it's unlikely to be thrown away immediately like so many pieces of advertising would be. I mean, if you get an advertising flyer in the mail, it goes immediately in the recycling bin probably. But this, because of the humorous map on it, it was kept. And because on the backside, we have all kinds of information about how Shell can help you in your travels. It's doing a fine job of advertising the company. And you notice there are no Standard Oil stations or Texaco stations on that map.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So this map appears in our exhibition in a section called Why Persuade, where we've broken down several answers to that question. Why would somebody want to persuade with a map? What are the reasons for doing that form of communication? And of course, one of the obvious reasons is to sell something. And this map is obviously selling something. It was printed by a commercial company, Shell, to sell you oil and services and repair work. And it does so by combining this really beautiful illustrative cartography with a not so subtle message about who you might want to consider working with when you need your car tuned up, right?
And advertising maps or maps in advertising are a very prominent part of the persuasive genre. Probably the most classic one is the Sherwin-Williams that covers the world with paint pouring over the globe.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, advertising was a big part of it.
Yes, maybe tell us a little bit more with that Sherwin-Williams. The idea of covering the globe, covering the earth, global ambitions, global scope. It's a common geographic device to market a product. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, on that particular one, it shows a can of Sherwin-Williams paint, and it's pouring down, and it's red paint. Red is a very, very prominent color in persuasive work. And covering things is also a sort of a prominent kind of thing. And the fact that it is just flowing naturally from the top of the earth to the bottom is another element of it. And advertising maps were one of the reasons that I wound up calling this genre persuasive instead of something else.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about what the something else? What were, before you coined the term persuasive categories? What were some of the terms that historians of cartography were using to talk about these kind of maps?
When I first began looking at them, there were propaganda maps that had been used in World War II, particularly, but all wars, and the Nazi maps were called propaganda maps, and they were evil and nasty and so forth. There were a lot of similar maps in the United States in newspapers and magazines. Newsweek and Time featured a lot of these. And they weren't called propaganda maps. They were called journalistic cartography, because propaganda is evil and we weren't doing anything evil. And so at that time, I also realized that I had seen maps that were trying to sell things, advertising, maps in real estate, where they were trying to promote a new subdivision, and it would show it complete with swimming pools and all sorts of things. Of course, it hadn't been built yet. This was completely fantasy, but it was trying to sell this for real estate promotion. And so I realized that I had a group of maps that had a lot in common, but what could I call them? And so I thought about it, agonized, actually. What on earth could I use that would explain all of these maps that had common elements? And they were asking the reader to believe something, to buy something, to do something. And the word persuasive came to mind. And I realized, there I go. That's the term. And the definition I proposed was a type of cartography whose main object or effect is to change or in some way influence the reader's opinion. So, but I wanted to get away from that idea of evil, because that was one end of the spectrum.
And that's a perfect segue into the next map that we want to talk about. We talk about our associations with propaganda as being evil and manipulative, and being associated exclusively with sort of authoritarian regimes like the Nazis. Let's take a look at this next map, which appeared in the U.S. government series News Map in December of 1943. Tell us a little bit about this one.
Okay, this is a map by Richard Edes Harrison, who was one of the best-known cartographers in that period. He created a series of maps. This is not in that specific series, but he created a series of maps that dealt with World War II for Fortune magazine. And these were later collected into a book called Look at the World. That is just marvelous. And most of those were in full color, rather than just the black, white, and red of this one. His maps were usually on a projection that showed the Earth as a sphere, not the usual, at the time, Mercator projection, rectangular, a lot of distortion on size. These have distortion too, but the Mercator is very obviously distorted. And this particular map series, it has three parts. There's the main map, the little panel along the side, and of small maps that show Japan's conquests through the years. The main textual panel has statements by leaders of the three major powers, the United States, Great Britain, and China. And the main map's title is particularly, maybe to people who weren't around in World War II don't know, but Japan was called the land of the rising sun. And so this is a little play on words and showing, no, this is what's going to happen. Japan's going to be the land of the setting sun. And so it suggests that soon that sun will set. It uses the color red for Japan, who was the bad guy at the time. We always use red for the bad guy. And it's the pinkish, the faded red is showing the sphere of influence of Japan's power. And because of the way the Earth is tilted in this projection, it makes it very obvious that the influencing was flowing outward and downward from the nation of Japan. And that the sun was going to set and we were going to take care of that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how this map kind of plays on two competing emotions, right? It both wants to make Japan seem very menacing and aggressive, and also to make that menace seem superable, right? To show that it's a menace that the allies working together will defeat.
Right.
So it's supposed to make Japan, the Japanese Empire in 1943, seem both, hugely dominant, sweeping across half the globe, but also to reassure Americans and their allies and other people who would have been reading Newsmap that that era of supposed aggression will be coming to an end through the war effort.
And a lot of the maps, and this is an example, there's a lot of text to them as well.
Mm-hmm.
The main map, that, hits you immediately. Here it is. And then there's discussion and, what we're going to do. And so there's very frequently a little bit of explanation to them as well.
Yep. The use of this statement, right? The Allies covet no gain for themselves and have no thoughts of territorial expansion. Of course, we know better than that, although the United States didn't annex territory after the Second World War, the Second World War turned the United States into a global superpower with military bases all around the world. And Harrison's cartography, his global cartography, was part and parcel of that American projection of global power.
Very much, very much. And on many of them, he would have an unusual angle. He would have west at the top, and they gave the impression of 3D, and that you were. And one of the things that his maps did is that I have an atlas that my parents had during World War II. And it has a map that shows the Pacific, and it's on a Mercator projection. And it's centered on North America. And so Japan on that map is on one side of the earth, and the United States is on another, and particularly Pearl Harbor is on another. And people would look at that and, well, we're safe. Look how far away Japan is. But Harrison would put these spherical projections, and all of a sudden, oh, look how close that is. That's not far at all. And that's one of the reasons I think that Pearl Harbor was such a surprise to many people, because, well, plainly Japan had to go 3/4 of the way around the world to get to Pearl Harbor, but not if you look at it on one of these maps.
Harrison obviously made a deliberate choice to label San Francisco and to position the projection of this map just right so that San Francisco, California, would be peeking out over the eastern edge, right? Which was meant to convince Americans, this theater of war is in our backyard.
Yeah,
of course,
this is close.
Exactly. It's hard to imagine now, since we have Google Earth, we have digital maps, but like you said, at the time, the dominant forms of cartography would have made Hawaii seem very far away. The Philippines was a U.S. colony at the time as well, we know historically that Roosevelt administration was at pains to convince Americans that the Pearl Harbor attack was on our territory. Most Americans didn't think of Hawaii as part of their territory.
Exactly, it wasn't a state then.
Exactly.
I used to, when I was teaching my classes, and I would talk about the Cold War as well. And but when I was talking about projections, one of the things that I would do would be show a Mercator map of the world and just see where Russia is and see where Keokuk, Iowa is. Okay, and is Keokuk, Iowa in any danger of being bombed by the Soviet Union? And the students would look at it. Well, no, it's in the middle of the United States. It's very difficult to reach. Then I would show them a map on one of these projections or one centered on the North Pole, and I would draw a line from Moscow to Keokuk, and all of a sudden, oh, that's not that far away, is it?
Mm-hmm.
And it was an eye-opener.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you visit the digital exhibition in our projection section, we use another Harrison map, one of the ones that he produced for Fortune magazine, that's on a polar projection that makes explicitly exactly that point, to say that, you know, the war in Europe, the war in Asia, this of course is slightly before nuclear warfare, but it is the era of aerial warfare.
Right.
And Harrison saying, you know, a Mercator projection is not appropriate to map this type of war. We need global projections, because
Right.
that is the geography of war. Now that we have airplanes and radios and all of this other kind of destructive and communicative technology that can span the globe. Let's take a look at the next map. A classic type of persuasive cartography.
Yes, this one is a favorite, the Octopus Map, and this one was from 1877 by Fred Rose, and as you can see, it's called a seriocomic map. He made a series of these, and they were very popular in the 19th century. There were some other artists who made some similar kinds of things, and on this one, each country is represented by a caricature of its people. But Russia, which was seen as a threat, is shown by a giant octopus, and its arms are wrapping around other countries. And this is considered a suggestive symbol. That term, suggestive symbol, was coined by a Nazi cartographer who made these kinds of maps. And a suggestive symbol suggests something that might happen in many ways. And in this one, even though the map was made in 1877, it became a very popular symbol, a recurring symbol. And so during World War II in 1942, the Nazis portrayed the British Empire as an octopus with its tentacles encircling the world. And in 1945, an octopus represented IG Farben, which was a German conglomerate, and their directors were being tried as war criminals. And so IG Farben had its tentacles around the world, showing the international penetration by that conglomerate. And then in 1904, it was during the Russo-Japanese War, a Japanese artist drew, kind of expanded on this or drew on the work of Rose and created a very similar octopus map where Russia's tentacles extended more into Asia and Japan, and so a little more than this one did. It extends a little farther east. So it's been a very popular and effective, obviously, symbol for, 150 years now. And I wouldn't be surprised that someday someone will find an octopus map that predates.
Yeah, it's amazing the way that it takes a metaphor that's, really not in fact very threatening, right? An octopus is a pretty innocuous sea creature, but because it has been repeatedly invoked as this metaphor for acquisition, for reaching out, for acquiring, right? The mere suggestion of an octopus is enough to carry the argument that whatever is being seen as an octopus has its hands everywhere, is trying to get at everything.
Yes, and you can see his hands are wrapped around people's arms, and he's pulling them in. I think it's one of the most effective symbols ever.
One of the things we talk about in the show is how these sorts of symbols and visual languages get created, right? They don't just come from nowhere. It's not as if ever since the dawn of time, people have been using octopuses to symbolize, acquisitive empires. And even, even more simple symbols, we forget those are also constructed. So even something like a flow line or a star used to indicate a capital city. Those are all a type of language that has been constructed by repeated invocation in cartographic use, right? So even though Rose was an early innovator, and his skill as an illustrator made this map such a powerful argumentative punch, but because this map was printed, it wasn't printed in textbooks or dusty academic volumes, it was printed in newspapers and magazines and broadsides. And then that metaphor of the octopus could then circulate and circulate and circulate to the point where today, if we were to see a map of an octopus, we would know pretty clearly what kind of an argument was being made.
Exactly. And you mentioned that it was in newspapers, magazines, and now on the web, very common places to find these persuasive maps that they sort of hit you between the eyes and say, look at me, and then it makes its argument. And and most people aren't going to sit down and look at a serious journal article with graphics that are at least attempting to be objective, but they're going to see these.
Yep, the maps that are in newspapers now today, social media, cable news, those are far, far more broadly used and understood and a part of our mental imagination than the ones in official geography textbooks. And just as a reminder to everybody who's listening, all of the objects in the exhibition are available in our digital exhibition. You can find that at leventhalmap.org and zoom in on the objects, read the captions, and of course we'll be posting this video interview with Judith Tyner later. We're right about the halfway point, so I just want to remind our visitors of two quick little things. First is the exhibition itself. We hope you spend some time there exploring. And as you get a chance to look at it, and after we're finished with this talk, we'd love to get your feedback. This exhibition is an ongoing, living and breathing thing as we experiment with what it's like to run a museum online. And so we'd love to get your feedback. We have a very short survey up at bit.ly/BLparticipant. You can optionally enter for a drawing for a gift certificate if you give us your feedback. But mostly, we'd really love to know what you think of this series and of the digital exhibition. So Judith, let's jump back to our next map.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so we're jumping all the way into the 20th century here, into the 1980s. Tell us a little bit about what we're looking at.
Well, this is an unusual atlas. It's by William Bungay, and Bill Bungay was a radical cartographer of the 1960s, to the extent that he was actually blacklisted by the US government as a communist sympathizer. And this made him unemployable, and he moved to Canada. But much of his map work has been persuasive and includes things like a map of rat-bitten babies in Detroit. That's a persuasive title, if ever there was one. And this, the Nuclear War Atlas, was originally published not as a book, but a poster. And it has 28 maps on it in 4 different categories, as we can see from the bottom: blast, radiation, Star Wars, and the future. And the back of the poster had the text. And this was later produced as a book. But the map of the nuclear gas cloud, which is the one that we were featuring here today, I think, is a very good example of a persuasive map. It's showing what would happen if nuclear reactors I'm not sure, failed or were bombed or were in some way did something like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, if they all did it at once. And there are smaller dots that indicate where the nuclear reactors are. And then the red flowing blobs are indicating the path that the gas clouds would take if the reactors were destroyed. And red, of course, indicates danger. This whole atlas is basically red, white, and black. And the darker the red, the greater the danger. And the great danger doesn't show at the coast. It's showing that the gas clouds get bigger and bigger and darker the farther west they get blown by the prevailing winds, which were blowing from the west. And so this was an effective one.
I especially like this, and I talked a little bit about Bill Bunge's Detroit cartography at the beginning of last week's episode, but I especially like this series of maps because they're similar in a way to Richard Edes Harrison's work in the Second World War, in that they make the argument that the conventional forms of cartography are not enough to understand the new geography of warfare and hazard. And they almost make the argument that it's the old maps which are persuasive, that the old maps are persuading us to think the wrong things because they come from an earlier era, and we need these radically inventive new forms of cartography to accurately depict the world that we live in today. I think maybe my favorite of this series is this map, which is a little subtle and a little cheeky in a way. It says the closest neighbors ever, the Soviet Union and the United States. And on this map, the national boundaries of the USA are supposed to be horizontal red lines. Vertical red lines. And the national boundaries of the Soviet Union are supposed to be horizontal red lines. And what do we have? We have a grid covering the whole Earth. The actual United States and actual Soviet Union are not shown on this map. And the argument is that national boundaries are meaningless in an era when a nuclear missile can strike anywhere at any time, when there's warfare in outer space. And it's such an interesting argument that Bunge's saying that if we look at a map that seems to contain warfare within national boundaries, then we've totally missed the real geographic reality of what a nuclear war would mean or look like.
What the impact would be.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so it's really interesting to see Bunge experiment again with these forms of cartography that are meant to catch up with the speed and the speed of change, the speed at which he certainly felt the world was headed towards a catastrophe in the 20th century. Maybe we talk a little bit. You mentioned the use of color, and of course, talk a little bit about the relationship between technically what it's possible to do and the way that cartographers use those technical possibilities, right? So on a map like this, which would have been an important feature would have been that it could be produced cheaply so that it could be printed. You wouldn't want to have a expensive full color printing on a series like this, because if everyone cost $100, you wouldn't be able to make up very many of them. Exactly. So obviously it was printed in two color printing, and Bunge chose red, as we see oftentimes in these kinds of maps, to symbolize danger. You say a little about the way that what kinds of technical possibilities are available to cartographers shape the ways that they're able to persuade?
Well, in a sense, we talk about, and you and I had talked about, that all maps are persuasive to some extent. And so what do we mean? And part of what is going on is the use of color. Now, in the 19th century, color was very expensive, and the 18th century, it had to be applied by hand, so you didn't get a lot of color on maps. But in the 20th century, color printing became comparatively inexpensive. And so more and more colors were put on maps. And colors have symbolic meanings. We've been talking about red being danger. And these symbolic meanings can differ from country to country, or even time to time, because red can mean danger, but it can also mean bravery or courage. In China, red is a happy color. It's the color of weddings. White is for mourning, not for weddings. And yellow in the American culture means cowardice. So if you color a country yellow on a map, you're saying that it's full of yellow-bellied cowards. And so these colors have connotations, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. Unfortunately, a lot of cartographers aren't aware of it, and they inadvertently create persuasive maps. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, that's great. And maybe let's circle back. I want to think later in the conversation about, today's maps and how GIS and web maps are shaping, reshaping, but also bringing back some of the same things that have always been at issue in persuasive cartography. But I want to pick up on something you just said. You mentioned, in a certain sense, we could call all maps persuasive maps, right? Even a map that, let's say a soil scientist is making a map of soil types. It's not trying to sell anything. They're not trying to convince you to go to war, but they're still trying to convince you that their science is good, right? That, it really is accurate that the soil type is in this part of the state and so on. So can you talk a little bit about this term, you told us about how you thought of the term persuasive cartography as kind of a larger category than mere propaganda and mere evil maps, to think about communication and rhetoric. But tell us a little bit about, as you went through your career as a historian of cartography, that term persuasion, does it make sense to think of it really as a binary, that some maps are persuasive and others aren't? Or is it kind of spectrum that all maps have persuasive elements embedded in them?
Yeah, that my thinking on that changed between the dissertation and the first article I wrote on that, which was about 8 years different. And I realized that it isn't an either or. There is a continuum. It's in a way, this is a tough question, but in the idea of the binary, okay, maps were either objective, scientific, etc., or they were propagandistic and evil. Well, a lot of maps are at one end of the spectrum, but there is a whole range, because we tend to think of maps as objective, scientific, and particularly back in that era, we were very big on scientific maps and communication and all of that. But maps aren't air photos. They don't show everything that's beneath them. They're selective. And as soon as you start getting selective, things change a little. On most of the so-called scientific maps, the cartographer tries to be objective, but it doesn't always work. We've been talking about the projections. Maps are flat, the Earth is spherical. Automatically, you're going to have some distortion because the map's projected onto a flat surface. And the projection can be chosen deliberately so that the map is misleading. And another aspect is that maps are symbolic, and the symbols range from very simple geometric shapes up to octopi. And we already mentioned that some maps are in color, and the colors have connotations. Symbols can be dynamic, which suggests movement, arrows, flows, as we saw in the Harrison map. And we've mentioned the suggestive symbols, but there's an implied meaning, and the octopus isn't the only one. Spiders, knives, sharks have been used, cutting lines with sharks. And one of the aspects, so we can see that there really is a continuum from those who are trying to be objective and those who are trying to be persuasive, and a lot in between. But there's something else that we need to look at, and that's that not all maps, not all persuasive maps are deliberately persuasive. It's very easy for an unaware cartographer to choose a symbol or a color or a projection that causes the map to mislead. And another aspect is the map user. Map user might not be familiar with some of the conventions. And one that always comes to mind for me, on maps that use colors to represent elevation. Traditionally, they started with dark green for the lowest elevations and progressed up through yellows. And so this meant that a lot of untrained readers, they would look at the greens, the yellows, browns, and they would think, green, it's got a lot of vegetation. The yellows and browns and tans, well, they're desert-like. And the green ones are, maybe even humid, not recognizing that it's only showing elevation. And very often on these maps, Death Valley is shown in the darkest green on the map. And they're not deliberately trying to mislead, but they are misunderstood by untrained map readers.
It's funny you say, I don't think I can pivot my webcam correctly, but I've got my Raven maps, 48 states right over me in this direction, and it has Death Valley as dark green. And I'm always curious when people look at that, I say, Death Valley, it's dark green. Why,
yes, I've spent a lot of time in Death Valley, and trust me,
it's not very green.
No, not at all.
So tell, maybe as a last topic, and then I want to open it up to questions from our live viewers. You raised the question of what is the map viewer's responsibility, right? If we take it that really every map can be persuasive, either deliberately or accidentally, either for the purposes of manipulation or merely for rhetorical purposes. Some people might hear that and say, well, I just shouldn't trust any map. Every map is deceitful, and take an almost conspiratorial attitude towards, well, map making is meant to distort the world. I can't trust the evidence of my eyes. If we don't want to think in a kind of tossing out all maps as all being fundamentally flawed by the processes of cartographic representation, what do we need to do as viewers, readers, consumers of maps to take an educated stance when we look at them?
Well, having taught map reading for many, many years, having classes in map reading would help. It's not fashionable right now. There's the feeling that, everyone knows how to read a map. Oh, it's just obvious. But everyone doesn't know how to read a map. There was a thing several years ago that women particularly can't read maps. Men can, but women can't. And the study is very flawed. But part of it, when women couldn't read maps, was the training. I have my ancient Girl Scout handbook still. There is nothing in it about map reading except it says you should learn how to read maps. On the other hand, the Boy Scout handbook, it went into great detail on how to read and use maps. They aren't that obvious. Maybe a simple map, but even on a road map, you need to learn what those symbols mean. And things are left out of maps. And so you go looking at the GPS on your car, and it's showing the roads, but some show railroads, some don't show railroads. I mean, why show a railroad? You're going to be in a car. Well, you might want to know what those things are that you're going to be crossing, or what's paralleling your road. There are a lot of things that get left out, and readers aren't always that aware of it. I have a wonderful quote that I have to use. David Greenhood was a fellow who, interesting guy, but he wrote a map reading book in 1944 when, this was a period when FDR was telling people to take out a map of the world or take out an atlas, look at the map. And so he had this excellent map reading book. But in it, he says at the start, people are plain suckers if they never question the reliability of maps shoved under their noses. The results might be the total loss of civil liberties. And I think that's just as valid now as it was in 44. You have to look at maps critically. We teach people critical thinking skills, to read critically. We need to read maps critically too.
It's a great way of putting it. And I think it really gets at one of our goals with the exhibition is to raise people's skepticism, not to make them disbelieve every map, but to encourage them to think critically about what they're seeing, even when what they're seeing is coming from a very reputable source, a scientific agency or a government publication. Even those kinds of maps are liable to have assumptions and biases about the world built into them. And so building a kind of informed skepticism, a criticality is what we're hoping to do in this exhibition, and of course also with the exhibition programs and public activities that we run and that will be part of this exhibition as it goes along. So I want to open it up to questions from our live audience. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, you should be able to enter questions into the comment section, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Of course, if we can't get to all of them, I just want to remind everybody that we do have upcoming events. Our next edition of this Angles on Bending Lines series will be next Wednesday at 1 p.m. again, where we'll be welcoming the collector historian PJ Mode to talk about different degrees of deception. PJ, of course, is an excellent collection of persuasive cartography that is on display at the Cornell University libraries. We are also doing a tour for educators this Friday at 1 p.m., where our education team will lead teachers as well as parents who are teaching their kids at home in this remote learning environment how to use the exhibition to approach the maps as an educational tool. And we're also co-sponsors of the Map Time series with our colleagues at the Harvard Map Collection, which is broadcast on Instagram Live each Thursday at noontime. I just want to remind folks, if you have a chance, we would love to get your feedback about this series at bit.ly/blparticipant. And it'll help us shape our upcoming programming and activities. So let's take a look at some of the questions. Josh Burnoff asks, I'm hoping you will get to address how technology, printing, display, and GIS has enabled new forms of persuasion. This gets a little bit back to a question I asked you before, Judith, but maybe let's think a little bit specifically about the ubiquity of maps. Now, everybody has a phone. Well, not everybody, but many people have phones that are more powerful geography tools than an entire cartography lab from 30 years ago. And we see maps get made and deleted and morphed and transformed in real time and on a daily basis. How has the way that maps have become such a part of our digital lives and the way that map making has become an intensely digital and data-driven process, how has that changed what can be done with persuasive cartography?
Well, I think in a sense we get more of the unintentional persuasion, and I'm thinking here of basic GIS thematic maps and the GPS maps that we have on our phones and our cars. And it has made me feel that it's even more important to be aware of what maps can and can't show. And we talked an earlier time, I mentioned that people have what I consider a touching faith in maps, that maps are the epitome of truth and accuracy. And this has been accentuated now with maps being created by computers, because there are some people who believe, well, you can't have any errors on a GIS map because it's not made by people. This isn't quite correct, but it's made by a computer. I even talked to one person who believed that the entire map on the GPS was beamed down from a satellite, not just coordinates, but the entire map was beamed down, and there was no human interaction on making that map. And this has led to some horror stories, something I've called death by GPS, where people have looked at their GPS, it shows a shortcut, it's paved according to the GPS, and they drive on it. Well, it turns out that it's dirt. Why they don't look out the window and look at the dirt road and say, gee, there might be something wrong here, and turn around, I don't know. But they will drive off onto the dirt road, figuring that sometime it's going to get paved, and they become stranded. And there have literally been cases where people have died from this kind of thing. And so I think it's even more important to be aware of what the basic pluses and minuses, the limitations of maps are. And not just assume that because it's made by a computer, it can't be persuasive. The newspapers are publishing maps, particularly in the pandemic. Our local newspaper produces a pandemic map of California every day, and one with the United States and one with the county. And for the most part, as far as I could see from looking at them, these seem to be reasonably well done, non-persuasive maps. But again, it's easy to do it accidentally, to choose an inappropriate color. The old book, How to Lie with Statistics, is, and the old saying, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. The same idea is here, and is something that we need to take into account, need to be thinking of.
Yep, that's a great way of putting it. We've talked in the episodes earlier about the way that these, especially big data sets, seem like they're just true. There's so much data there that the computer has crunched so much information that it must automatically be true, that we get lulled into a false sense of trust.
And particularly now, with all that's going on in the world, the pandemic and everything else, there are going to be a lot of maps coming out. And some are likely to be persuasive.
Yes. We have an interactive in the online exhibition called "Do You Trust This Map?" Where we're constantly gathering maps from the present day, from social media, from online news, from cable news, and we ask you, our readers, to say, what do you think? Is this a trustworthy map? And we're curious how logos and text and colors and different forms of representation produce either a sense of belief or a sense of skepticism. Here's another question from Louise Harrison Lepera. I wonder if you might both talk a little bit about which researchers from the discipline of rhetoric have been most important for your work in persuasive cartography.
I had not done as much on rhetoric at that, particularly when I did my dissertation, and even on more recent things. I know there are now a lot of people, because, well, there were, at that time, there were a lot of books out on propaganda, and there were books on visual rhetoric and so forth. Off the top of my head, since I wasn't expecting this question, I can't come up with the names. If you want to email me, I'd be happy to give you some of them.
I might mention too, I won't list off a whole bibliography, though there certainly is a bibliography of further reading on our online exhibition, which I encourage you to check out. But another field of study which has been influential on me, Judith, I'm sure you're familiar with it, and it's been taken up by geographers quite a bit, is a field called Science and Technology Studies, sometimes abbreviated as STS. And one of the key insights of STS is that science and technology are themselves social processes, and instead of thinking about science as this perfectly accurate, ever improving, a system of ever increasing accuracy about the world. Think about how science and knowledge are produce systems of belief, and how what we know, even in a scientific system, is based on forms of evidence and based on forms of persuasion, based on forms of authentication that rely on people's trust in one another, essentially. So thinking about interrogating science and scientific practices as something that's, we're not just measuring how accurate and precise they are, but rather how they work at a social level has been really influential on this exhibition, on my own work.
Yeah. Well, cartography, and particularly history of cartography, have been very closely intertwined with history of science and history of technology. There hasn't been as much written on some of the, particularly in the history of technology with cartography. I am surprised, because people are usually more interested in what the map is showing, what the map is telling, but the technology used to produce the map has a big impact. And we've been talking about the GIS and the computers. The first computer maps that I had to deal with, and this is really giving away my age, they were done using IBM punch cards, and the maps were printed basically looking like a picture that was made on a typewriter. The colors and shades were made up of letters overlaying and so forth. And what those maps looked like was very different from what a modern GIS map would look like. And yet, if we're looking at through the course of it, they had their own problems, their own difficulties of interpretation. They didn't stick around for very long, fortunately, but they were an early step. And we don't give much thought to, well, how is a map printed? What effect does that have on it? How does that affect what colors are chosen? I could give you a semester-long lecture on this, but we won't go there.
It's great. Well, we've reached the top of the hour. I know there's some more questions in the comments, so feel free to reach out to us. I wish I could get to them all, but I promised Judith an hour, and you've been so excellent. So please join me in thanking Professor Judith Tyner for joining us today. I feel like we talk about authority and belief in our exhibition. I feel like now we truly have the stamp of authority on this exhibition about persuasive cartography, having had her join us for this conversation. Just as a reminder, you can spend all the time you like exploring the digital exhibition online. Visit us at leventhalmap.org. Next week, we'll have our guest PJ Mode on our next episode of Angles on Bending Lines. And this Friday at 1 p.m., there's a tour for educators or parents working at home with students to think about using the exhibition as a teaching tool. And again, Professor Judith Tyner, Professor Emerita at California State University, Long Beach, and the coiner of the term persuasive cartography. Thanks, Judith, so much for being here. We're looking forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
And I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm the curator of maps at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. Please visit our online exhibition for more, and we look forward to seeing as many of you as next week as possible.